Welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself.
The moment everything began to shift, it felt less like a revelation and more like a quiet imbalance, the kind you only notice when you're already leaning and don't remember choosing to move. What set it in motion was ordinary enough that I didn't mark it as important at the time. A piece of paper taped to the refrigerator door, written in her neat, deliberate handwriting, listing foods, portions, and simple rules. No drama, no ultimatum. She framed it as a shared reset, a month of eating with intention, a way to feel lighter and clearer together. I agreed easily, almost lazily, assuming it would be another brief experiment we'd half follow and eventually forget. I thought the plan would change my habits, maybe my body. I didn't imagine it would unsettle the way I understood myself. She had always approached life with a kind of quiet discipline that impressed me. Not rigid, not controlling, just attentive. She noticed how things affected her and adjusted accordingly. Food, sleep, work, even conversations. I admired that about her while secretly believing I didn't need it. I'd learned to function without listening much to myself. I met expectations, filled roles, kept things moving. If something fell off, I ignored it until it dulled. That strategy had worked well enough for years, which is why I trusted it. The meals themselves were unremarkable. Clean, simple, repetitive. Less of everything I'd used to distract myself. No grazing, no eating out of boredom, no numbing fullness at the end of the day. What surprised me was what replaced it. Silence at first, then awareness. Without the constant cycle of craving and reward, I felt exposed, like a layer of insulation had been peeled away. Hunger became a sensation instead of a problem. So did fatigue. So did emotion. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way I sat, the way I moved through rooms, the unconscious effort I put into taking up space in a way that felt expected. I noticed how differently she inhabited her body, not apologetically, not defensively, but with familiarity. She talked about food in terms of how it made her feel grounded or unsettled, energized or heavy. Listening to her, I realized I'd never learned to describe my body from the inside. I'd treated it like equipment. Physically, the changes were gradual but visible. Weight dropped. My clothes loosened. People commented in passing, offering approval as if improvement were self-evident. I accepted the compliments without much thought, but internally something else was happening. I felt less braced against the world. Not weaker, more permeable. Emotions reached me faster. I laughed more easily, but I also felt unsettled by small things. It was as if reducing what I consumed had increased what I perceived. One evening, after a long day, she looked at me and smiled and said the plan was really agreeing with me. That I seemed calmer, more patient. Softer, she said, and then quickly added, in a good way. She meant it kindly, affectionately. I smiled back. But the words stayed with me long after the conversation moved on. Softer. It felt descriptive in a way that made me uncomfortable and relieved at the same time. The first step I took beyond observation wasn't planned. It happened on a rushed afternoon when I was folding laundry, distracted and pressed for time. I picked up a top that wasn't mine and realized it as soon as I touched it. The fabric was lighter, the cut unfamiliar. I should have put it back immediately. Instead, I paused. Not out of excitement or rebellion, but curiosity. A simple, quiet wondering about how it would feel. I told myself it was practical, that I'd just try it on briefly since it was clean and I was already changing. I slipped it on beneath my sweater and didn't even look in the mirror. What struck me wasn't appearance. It was sensation. The way the fabric rested on my shoulders made me aware of my breathing. The way it moved with me made me conscious of motion I usually ignored. I didn't feel like I was pretending to be someone else. I felt like I was noticing myself from a different angle. I changed back before she came home. I folded the top carefully and put it away exactly where I'd found it. The rest of the evening passed normally, but inside me there was a low, persistent hum. Not guilt, not excitement. Something closer to recognition, mixed with responsibility. I'd crossed a line I hadn't known was there, And instead of feeling wrong, it felt revealing. As the days passed, the diet continued to do what it was supposed to do, and something else entirely. I began to understand that my sense of self, something I'd assumed was fixed, was more conditional than I'd believed. Shaped by routines, expectations, and unexamined habits. The plan hadn't created new feelings so much as removed the noise that had been covering old ones. I started writing at night, something I'd never had the patience for before. Not calorie counts or progress notes, but fragments of thought. Questions without answers. Words that kept repeating. Permission, fear, honesty. I wrote about the top. About the word softer. About a growing sense that I'd been living slightly misaligned, close to myself, but not quite inside. Even then, I knew this wasn't something I could let turn into a secret life. Not because secrecy itself is always wrong, but because I valued integrity too much to let silence harden into deception. At the same time, I understood that speaking before I understood myself would be careless. That tension between honesty and comprehension settled into me and stayed. On the refrigerator, the diet plan remained unchanged, a list of meals and shared intentions. Outwardly, nothing dramatic had happened. But internally, attention had shifted, and once that happens, there is no returning to unawareness. I had begun listening, and I didn't yet know where that would lead. What changed next did not arrive as a decision. It arrived as a series of small adjustments that, taken individually, seemed harmless enough that I didn't challenge them. Looking back, I understand that this is how most meaningful shifts happen, not through declarations but through accommodation. You make room for something once, then again, and eventually you realize you've reorganized your inner life around it. The diet plan settled into our routines so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like a plan at all. It became background structure, like the timing of our mornings or the way the light came through the kitchen window in the late afternoon. We shopped differently, cooked differently, spoke differently about our days. There was a gentleness to it that surprised me. No rules enforced with tension, no sense of moral failure when something didn't go perfectly. If anything, it encouraged reflection rather than judgment. When something didn't sit right, she would pause and ask why, not just what. That question began to follow me into places far removed from food. I became more aware of my emotional responses, not because I was trying to be, but because they were louder now that I wasn't numbing them. I noticed irritation before it turned into silence. Sadness before it became distance. Even joy felt different, less explosive, more sustained. This increased sensitivity was not always comfortable. There were days I longed for the bluntness of my old habits, for the easy escape of distraction. But I also sensed that returning to that numbness would cost me something I wasn't ready to give up. The memory of that afternoon with the borrowed top didn't fade the way I expected it to. It didn't intrude constantly, but it stayed accessible, like a reference point. I found myself thinking about it during unrelated moments, while commuting, while standing in line, while brushing my teeth. Not replaying it exactly, but considering what it had revealed. The fact that it hadn't felt performative. The fact that it hadn't felt like a joke or a thrill. It had felt like alignment, brief and quiet. For a while, I told myself that was enough. That awareness alone was the lesson, and that acting further would be unnecessary, even irresponsible. I reminded myself of the life I had, the commitments I'd made, the trust that existed between us. I wasn't interested in unraveling that. What I didn't yet understand was that suppression isn't the same thing as restraint, and that refusing to look more closely doesn't preserve stability. It just postpones reckoning. The next boundary I crossed was still modest, but more intentional. It happened on a weekend morning when she was out running errands. I had the apartment to myself, time unstructured. I found myself lingering near the closet without quite admitting why. The feeling wasn't urgency. It was patience. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if speed might turn the act into something it wasn't. I chose something simple, neutral, something that wouldn't have drawn attention, even if someone had seen it folded on a chair. I paid attention not just to how it felt to wear it, but to how it changed my posture, my movements, the way I related to my reflection. I didn't study myself critically. I observed, the way you might observe a mood passing through you. There was no rush of excitement, no sense of transgression. There was a calm that bordered on relief. What unsettled me most was how ordinary it felt, how quickly my nervous system adapted. I realized that much of my prior resistance hadn't been about the act itself, but about the meaning I'd been taught to assign to it. Without an audience, real or imagined, the meaning dissolved, leaving only experience. That realization carried weight. It suggested that many of the limits I'd accepted as inherent were, in fact, negotiated socially and enforced internally. I didn't stay like that long. I changed back, restored everything to its place, and went about the rest of my day. But something had shifted. I no longer thought of that first moment as an anomaly. It now felt like the beginning of a pattern, and patterns demand interpretation. I began asking myself questions I'd avoided for years. Not dramatic ones about labels or outcomes, but quieter ones about comfort, authenticity, and why certain forms of expression felt forbidden to me in the first place. I thought about childhood, about the lessons absorbed without consent, about which behaviors were praised, which were tolerated, and which were quietly ridiculed until I learned not to consider them. I realized how early I'd learned to associate softness with vulnerability and vulnerability with risk. How I'd equated safety with conformity, even when conformity felt constricting. These weren't revelations so much as recognitions, things I'd always known in pieces, now assembling themselves. My relationship with her took on new texture during this time, though outwardly nothing had changed. If anything, we were closer. The diet plan had made us more present with each other. We cooked together, talked more, argued less. I found myself listening to her with increased attentiveness, not just to her words, but to her pauses. At times, this closeness made my private exploration feel heavier, not lighter. The more I valued what we had, the more seriously I took the responsibility of honesty. I began to consider what honesty actually required. Did it mean immediate disclosure of every internal shift? Or did it mean doing the work to understand myself before inviting someone else into that uncertainty? I didn't want to treat her like a sounding board for confusion I hadn't yet earned clarity around. At the same time, I didn't want to hide behind the excuse of self-discovery indefinitely. That balance between transparency and thoughtfulness became a moral question I returned to repeatedly. Social awareness crept in next, uninvited but inevitable. I started noticing how rigidly gendered our environment was, not in overt ways, but in subtle assumptions. The way clothing stores were arranged, the way compliments were framed, the way certain emotions were welcomed from some bodies and discouraged from others. These observations weren't accompanied by anger, at least not initially. They were accompanied by curiosity and a growing sense of empathy for myself and for others navigating similar constraints with far greater stakes. There were moments of doubt, too. Times when I worried I was overinterpreting a series of harmless behaviors. Times when I questioned whether this attention was self-indulgent, whether I was inventing complexity where none existed. On those days, I tried to return to first principles. How did this exploration affect my capacity for kindness, for patience, for responsibility? Did it make me more honest or less? More grounded or more fragmented? The answers were not always consistent, but they were sincere. Physically, the changes from the diet continued, and with them came a strange mirroring. As my body became lighter, my internal sense of identity felt less fixed, more responsive. I noticed how much of my previous self-concept had been built around resistance, resisting hunger, resisting emotion, resisting curiosity. Letting go of one form of resistance had weakened the others. This wasn't a loss of control, as I'd once feared. It felt more like a redistribution of it. I didn't know where any of this would lead. I still don't, even now, claim to have known then. What I did know was that pretending nothing was happening would be dishonest, and forcing a conclusion would be equally so. I was in the middle of something that required patience, humility, and care, not just for myself, but for the people whose lives were intertwined with mine. The diet plan had done its work on the surface. It had reshaped routines, habits, and health. Beneath that, it had done something far more consequential. It had taught me to listen, and once you learn that skill, it doesn't limit itself to safe subjects. It asks to be applied everywhere. There is a point in any slow transformation where the mind stops asking whether something is happening and begins asking how to live with it. I crossed that point without ceremony. No dramatic realization, no sudden clarity. Just a quiet exhaustion from pretending I was still undecided when, in truth, I was already adapting. By then, the diet had ceased to feel like a project and had become a context. Our days were structured around it without effort. Meals were planned, conversations flowed more easily, and our shared sense of momentum felt oddly intimate. There was trust in that rhythm, a mutual confidence that we were moving towards something better, even if neither of us could articulate exactly what that meant. I was acutely aware of how fragile that trust was, not because she had done anything to undermine it, but because I felt myself changing in ways she didn't yet know. My internal world had grown more complex, but also more precise. I wasn't spiraling or fantasizing or escaping. I was observing. I paid attention to how different environments affected me, how certain expectations tightened my chest while others seemed to ease it. I noticed how often I adjusted myself before anyone else had a chance to react, how deeply ingrained that reflex was. These observations weren't accusations, they were data. And the more data I collected, the harder it became to dismiss the pattern. I began to understand that what I was responding to wasn't clothing or appearance in isolation, but permission. Permission to inhabit my body without bracing against it. Permission to move without performing strength. Permission to experience gentleness without immediately translating it into weakness. These were not things I'd been explicitly denied, but they were things I'd learned not to request. At home, alone, I allowed myself more moments of experimentation, not to chase a feeling, but to study it. I was careful, deliberate. I noticed how different choices influenced my mood, my sense of coherence. Some things felt neutral. Some felt grounding. Others felt like overcorrection, as if I were trying too hard to make something happen. Those moments taught me restraint. This wasn't about accumulating experiences. It was about understanding alignment. What surprised me most was how this process sharpened my sense of ethics rather than dulling it. I became more conscious of the implications of my actions, even the private ones. I asked myself not just what felt good or right internally, but how my choices might ripple outward. Would they make me more present or more divided? More capable of honesty or more skilled at concealment? These questions mattered to me deeply, perhaps because I'd spent so much of my earlier life avoiding them. My relationship with her remained central to my thinking. I watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with care. I noticed the ways she trusted me, the assumptions she made about my steadiness, my reliability. I didn't feel trapped by those assumptions, but I felt accountable to them. They were based on years of shared life, of mutual support. I wasn't willing to treat that history casually. At the same time, I began to see that withholding my inner life entirely would eventually become its own form of dishonesty. Not because I owed her every passing thought, but because sustained intimacy depends on being known in meaningful ways. The question wasn't whether to speak, but when and how. I wanted to reach a place where I could articulate my experience without defensiveness or confusion, where I could speak from understanding rather than impulse. Outside her home, the world felt subtly different. I noticed social interactions with a new lens. The unspoken rules about how I was expected to behave, what emotions were acceptable to show, what kinds of curiosity were permitted. These rules had always been there, but I'd internalized them so thoroughly that I'd mistaken them for personal preference. Seeing them clearly for the first time was disorienting, but also strangely liberating. If these norms were learned, they could also be questioned. I found myself feeling a growing empathy for people whose identities were more visibly at odds with expectation. Not abstract empathy, but practical awareness, the kind that notices how much energy it takes to navigate misunderstanding, how exhausting it can be to translate yourself constantly. I hadn't faced overt hostility or risk, and I knew that. That knowledge made me cautious about overstating my struggle. But it didn't invalidate the insight. Understanding exists on a spectrum, and this was my entry point. There were moments of fear, too. Quiet ones, usually late at night, when I imagined possible futures and felt overwhelmed by their implications. Not catastrophes, but conversations, reactions, misinterpretations. I worried about being seen inaccurately, about being reduced to a narrative that wasn't mine. I worried about disappointing people I respected. These fears didn't stop me, but they slowed me down, forced me to proceed with care. The diet plan, oddly enough, continued to serve as an anchor. Its emphasis on listening, on adjusting without judgment, provided a framework I could apply elsewhere. When something felt off, I didn't immediately label it as failure. I asked why. When something felt right, I didn't rush to cling to it. I observed. This approach kept me grounded during moments when my thoughts threatened to race ahead of my understanding. I began to sense that whatever this process ultimately led to, it was shaping me into someone more attentive, more reflective. I was less reactive, more deliberate. I handled conflict with greater patience. I listened better. These changes reassured me. They suggested that self-exploration, when approached with integrity, doesn't have to fracture a life. It can refine it. Still, refinement requires pressure. And I could feel that pressure building. Not from outside forces, but from the simple truth that growth eventually demands expression. I was approaching a point where silence would stop being neutral. I didn't yet know what I would say, or when I would say it. But I knew that the question was no longer hypothetical. The transformation underway wasn't dramatic or visible. It was internal, ethical, cumulative. It was teaching me that identity is not something you uncover once and then defend forever. It is something you participate in consciously or not. For the first time, I was choosing participation. The pressure I'd been feeling did not explode. It condensed. It became denser, more focused, like a question that refuses to stay abstract once it realizes it has a real address. I woke up one morning with a clear sense that whatever this was, it was no longer content to remain purely internal. Not because it demanded action, but because it demanded coherence. I had begun to notice a subtle split in myself, not between who I was and who I pretended to be, but between who I was becoming and how carefully I was managing that becoming. I was thoughtful, restrained, intentional. And yet, there was an increasing gap between my inner honesty and my outward transparency. That gap wasn't yet deception, but I could feel how easily it could become one if left unattended. The diet plan had taught me that ignoring signals doesn't make them disappear, it just forces them to speak louder later. Hunger ignored becomes fixation. Fatigue ignored becomes resentment. I began to suspect the same was true of identity. The more respectfully I treated my inner experience, the less it demanded dramatic expression. But respect, I was learning, also meant acknowledgement. I started paying attention to how often I edited myself in conversation. Not lying, exactly, just redirecting. Choosing safer topics. Deflecting personal questions with humor or generalities. These were habits I'd perfected long before this period of my life, but now I could see them clearly. I wasn't just protecting privacy, I was protecting an image of consistency. I wanted to be legible to others, even if that legibility came at the cost of accuracy. At home, she noticed changes in me that I hadn't named aloud. She commented on my increased patience, my attentiveness. She said I seemed more present, more thoughtful. These observations were offered warmly, but they landed with weight. They told me that my inner work was visible, even if its source was not. That visibility raised the stakes. I wasn't changing in a vacuum. I was changing in relationship. There were moments when I considered speaking, when the words gathered themselves almost fully formed. Usually, they came during quiet evenings, when we were sitting together without distraction. I would feel the impulse rise, then pause. Not out of fear exactly, but out of respect for timing. I wanted to be sure that when I spoke, I could do so without asking her to carry confusion that belonged to me. In the meantime, my private exploration became less about discovery and more about integration. I wasn't chasing novelty. I was asking what belonged, what endured beyond initial curiosity. I paid attention to which experiences left me feeling more centered afterward, and which left me restless or scattered. That distinction mattered. It helped me understand that authenticity isn't about intensity, it's about sustainability. I thought a great deal about responsibility during this time, about the difference between self-denial and self-discipline, about how easily the language of obligation can be used to justify avoidance, just as easily as the language of freedom can be used to justify carelessness. I didn't want either trap. I wanted a way forward that honored both my inner truth and the commitments I'd made. Social awareness deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. I became more attuned to how often people speak past one another when it comes to identity, how quickly assumptions replace listening. I saw how stories get flattened into symbols, how complexity gets traded for convenience. This made me wary of rushing to define myself publicly, even in small ways. I wanted to protect the nuance of my experience, not dilute it into something easier for others to categorize. At the same time, I recognized a growing need to practice courage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that allows for misunderstanding without immediate correction. The courage to be seen imperfectly. I realized how much energy I'd spent trying to preempt misinterpretation, trying to control the narrative before it existed. Letting go of that impulse felt risky but also necessary. The diet plan entered its later phase, where the initial enthusiasm gave way to maintenance. There were fewer conversations about rules and more about balance. This mirrored my internal process uncannily. I wasn't trying to change myself anymore. I was trying to live well with who I was becoming. That meant accepting ambiguity, accepting that not every question needed an immediate answer. One afternoon, I caught my reflection unexpectedly, not posed, not evaluated. Just a moment of recognition. I didn't feel surprise or judgment. I felt familiarity. That moment stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. It suggested that whatever I was integrating was no longer foreign. It was becoming part of how I recognized myself. Still, recognition alone was not enough. Integration requires context, and context includes other people. I could feel the approaching necessity of conversation, not as a confession, but as an extension of intimacy. I wanted to speak from a place of steadiness, not urgency. From care, not self-protection. The question shifted from should I say something? To what kind of person do I want to be when I do? That question guided me more reliably than any impulse. It reminded me that this process was not just about identity, but about character. About how to move through uncertainty without abandoning principle. I didn't yet know the shape that conversation would take. I only knew that avoiding it indefinitely would undo the very growth I valued. Silence, once protective, was beginning to feel like stagnation. And stagnation, I had learned, is not neutrality. It is a choice with consequences. The transformation was no longer just internal. It was approaching the threshold of relationship, where private truth meets shared reality. I was standing at that threshold, not rushing, not retreating, but aware that remaining there forever was not an option. The conversation did not happen all at once. It began, as so much else had, with preparation rather than action. I found myself rehearsing not sentences, but intentions. What did I want this exchange to do? What did I want it not to do? I wasn't trying to persuade or confess or absolve myself. I wanted to invite understanding without demanding resolution. That distinction mattered more than wording. In the days leading up to it, though I didn't yet know which day it would be, I became unusually attentive to my own emotional state. I didn't want to speak from agitation or from relief-seeking. I wanted to speak from steadiness. That meant waiting until the idea of silence felt heavier than the risk of speech, but not so heavy that it turned into desperation. It was a narrow window, and I watched myself carefully for it. What complicated things was how good our life felt at that moment. The diet plan had settled into something sustainable, almost invisible. We had our rhythm back, perhaps even improved. We laughed easily. We disagreed, without escalation. There was trust in our routines and warmth in our shared quiet. This contentment made the prospect of disruption feel almost irresponsible. Why disturb something that was working? But another question followed immediately. Working for whom? And at what cost? I had learned enough by then to know that unspoken truths don't stay contained. They leak, not always as words, but as distance, as restraint, as a subtle withholding of presence. I didn't want to become someone who was emotionally careful in a way that felt like absence. I noticed how often I paused before answering simple questions. Not because the answers were dangerous, but because I was filtering them for consistency. I realized that maintaining an image requires constant vigilance, and vigilance erodes ease. The version of me she interacted with was still genuine, but increasingly curated. That was the clearest signal I had that something needed to change. The day it finally began was unremarkable. No argument, no special occasion. We were making dinner together, moving around each other with the familiarity of long practice. At some point, I felt that internal alignment I'd been waiting for, not certainty, but readiness. I knew that if I didn't speak then, I would regret it, not because of fear, but because of avoidance. I started slowly, not with conclusions but with process. I talked about the diet plan, about how unexpectedly influential it had been, about how listening to my body had opened doors I hadn't known were closed. I spoke carefully, watching her face, her posture, not for approval but for presence. She listened without interrupting, which both steadied and unnerved me. I told her that I'd been learning things about myself that surprised me. That some of those things had to do with how I experienced my body, my sense of comfort, my relationship to expression. I avoided labels deliberately. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't want to outsource my explanation to categories that might carry assumptions I wasn't ready to address. When I finally spoke about clothing, I did so plainly, without dramatization. I framed it not as a revelation of behavior, but as an insight into experience. I explained how certain moments of expression had made me feel more present, more coherent, rather than distracted or performative. I emphasized what this process had taught me about myself, not what it demanded of anyone else. There was a long pause after I finished. Not a charged one, but a thoughtful one. She didn't rush to respond, and I was grateful for that. When she did speak, her questions were careful. She asked what this meant to me. She asked what it didn't mean. She asked how long I'd been thinking about it. These questions weren't interrogations. They were attempts to orient herself. I answered honestly, even when the answers were incomplete. I told her I didn't have a roadmap, that I wasn't seeking immediate change or resolution, that my primary concern was integrity, being truthful without being reckless. I acknowledged the uncertainty explicitly because pretending otherwise would have undermined everything I was trying to do. What I hadn't anticipated was how much space she would make. Not instant understanding, not instant comfort, but space. She said she needed time, not because she was rejecting what I'd shared, but because she wanted to respond thoughtfully rather than reflexively. That distinction mattered immensely. It told me she was taking both me and herself seriously. The days that followed were delicate. We were both attentive, perhaps overly so. There was no hostility, but there was caution. We were renegotiating understanding in real time. Some moments felt awkward, others unexpectedly tender. We spoke more explicitly about boundaries, about reassurance, about what support looked like when neither person had all the answers. I was careful not to accelerate the process externally just because I'd named it internally. I didn't want to turn disclosure into performance. I continued my private reflection, but now was informed by dialogue rather than isolation. That made it heavier in some ways, but also more grounded. My inner life was no longer sealed off, it was contextualized. Social implications became more concrete after that. I began to consider not just hypothetical reactions but real ones. Friends, family, colleagues. Not in terms of disclosure plans, but in terms of values. What kind of openness felt appropriate? What kind of privacy was protective rather than avoidant? These were not questions with universal answers, and I resisted the urge to adopt someone else's script. I noticed a shift in how I related to the world outside our home. I felt less need to prove anything, but also more aware of how much of daily life relies on unspoken assumptions. I became gentler with myself when I felt misaligned with those assumptions, recognizing that discomfort was information, not indictment. Emotionally, I oscillated between relief and vulnerability. Relief that I was no longer carrying this alone. Vulnerability, because being known always introduces risk. But the risk felt proportional considered. I wasn't leaping into the unknown. I was stepping into it with care. The diet plan officially ended around that time, transitioning fully into habit. We celebrated quietly, not with indulgence, but with acknowledgement. It felt symbolic in a way neither of us commented on directly. One structured experiment had ended, but its deeper effects were still unfolding. I understood then that transformation isn't a single arc. It's layered. You change internally, then relationally, then socially, each layer informing the others. Skipping a layer creates imbalance. I was moving slowly because I wanted coherence, not speed. What lay ahead was still uncertain. There would be misunderstandings, adjustments, probably mistakes. But I had crossed a critical threshold. I was no longer alone with my questions, and I was no longer pretending they didn't exist. That, more than any specific outcome, felt like progress. After the conversation, time behaved differently. Not faster or slower, but thicker, as if each day carried more information than it used to. Nothing dramatic happened immediately, and yet everything felt newly consequential. Ordinary moments took on a faint gravity because they were no longer buffered by omission. I was living more transparently, even when nothing was being actively said. We settled into a careful rhythm. Not fragile, but deliberate. There was a shared understanding that we were both adjusting, mapping new emotional terrain, without reliable landmarks. Some days we talked openly, revisiting parts of the conversation, clarifying what had been misunderstood or left unsaid. Other days we let the subject rest, allowing normal life to reassert itself. That alternation turned out to be essential. Constant processing would have turned reflection into fixation. Silence, when chosen consciously, became a form of trust rather than avoidance. I became more aware of how often people confuse clarity with certainty. I was clear about what I was experiencing, but uncertain about where it would ultimately lead. That distinction was difficult for others, and sometimes for me, to hold. The instinct to resolve ambiguity is powerful, especially when it touches identity. But I was learning that unresolved truth is still truth, and that patience can be a form of integrity. Internally, something had shifted from exploration to responsibility. Before, my focus had been on understanding myself. Now, it included understanding my impact. How my moods affected the room. How my silences were interpreted. How even small choices could either build trust or erode it. This awareness didn't make me anxious. It made me careful in a grounded way. I felt more adult than I ever had, not because I'd reached a conclusion, but because I was honoring process. There were moments when fear resurfaced unexpectedly. Not panic, but flashes of concern about future conversations, about being misunderstood, about losing ease in spaces where I'd once moved effortlessly. These moments often came after positive interactions, which surprised me. I realized that hope can be as destabilizing as fear because it raises the stakes. Caring deeply about outcomes makes vulnerability unavoidable. Socially, I began to notice how much of everyday interaction relies on shorthand. People categorize each other quickly, not out of malice, but out of efficiency. I had benefited from that shorthand for most of my life. I fit easily into expectations, rarely challenged, rarely questioned. Now, I could sense how precarious that ease was, not because I was doing anything visibly different, but because I knew how conditional acceptance can be. This realization didn't harden me against the world. It softened me toward others. I started noticing the small accommodations people make just to be legible, the careful self-editing, the strategic silences. I recognized versions of myself in them, past and present. That recognition expanded my empathy in a way no abstract argument ever could. At home, we negotiated boundaries that were practical as much as emotional. What felt supportive? What felt premature? What belonged to private space and what could be shared? These conversations were sometimes awkward, but they were grounded in mutual respect. We weren't trying to protect an illusion of normalcy. We were trying to build a version of it that was honest. I was careful not to turn self-expression into a test. I resisted the urge to push visibility simply to prove courage. Courage, I was learning, is not measured by exposure alone. It's measured by whether your actions align with your values over time. For me, those values included care, responsibility, and coherence. I wanted my outer life to move at the same pace as my inner understanding. There were days when I felt remarkably at ease, as if something that had long been misaligned was finally settling into place. On those days, the world felt quieter, more navigable. My thoughts were less scattered. My reactions more proportional. These moments reassured me that this process was not destabilizing me, it was integrating me. There were also days when I felt raw, uncertain, overly visible even in anonymity. On those days, I reminded myself that discomfort is not always a warning. Sometimes it's simply evidence that you're no longer anesthetized. I practiced distinguishing between harm and unfamiliarity, a skill that took time and humility. One of the most unexpected developments was how this process affected my sense of accountability. I became less interested in defending myself and more interested in understanding consequences. If someone felt unsettled by my honesty, I didn't immediately frame that as their problem. I asked what part of my communication had been unclear, what reassurance I could offer without retreating into silence. This didn't mean taking responsibility for others' discomfort indiscriminately, but it did mean engaging with it thoughtfully. The diet plan, long finished as a formal structure, continued to echo through my thinking. Its core lesson, that the body communicates continuously and that ignoring it creates distortion, had generalized into a philosophy of living. I applied it to emotions, to relationships, to identity. Listen first. Adjust without panic. Avoid extremes. Trust accumulation over intensity. I thought often about how easily this story could have unfolded differently. How easily I could have dismissed early signals, joked them away, buried them under obligation or distraction. Many people do. Not because they lack courage, but because they lack space. I had been given space accidentally, through something as mundane as a shared attempt to eat better. That accident carried responsibility. To waste it would have been its own kind of failure. As months passed, the sense of crisis I'd initially feared never materialized. Instead, there was a steady reconfiguration. Some assumptions loosened. Some expectations adjusted. Some fears lost their urgency, simply by being acknowledged. I learned that not all change announces itself loudly. Some change just stays. I didn't suddenly feel complete or resolved. Those words belong to narratives that prefer endings to continuations. What I felt was more accurate. I felt inhabitable, like my inner life had become a place I could live in without constant management. The world did not transform around me. People did not suddenly become more perceptive or more kind. But I moved through it differently, with less bracing, less pretense, less fear of my own complexity. That difference mattered more than I'd expected. I understood then that identity is not a secret waiting to be revealed, nor a performance waiting to be perfected. It is a relationship between attention and action, between self-knowledge and responsibility. I was no longer asking who I was in isolation. I was asking how to live truthfully among others. That question did not have a final answer, but it had direction. And direction, I was learning, is often enough. What I didn't expect, as time continued to pass, was how ordinary my life would feel again, how quickly the unfamiliar could become integrated without losing its significance. The fear I'd once had, that acknowledging this part of myself would permanently destabilize everything else, proved to be rooted in an old belief that identity is a zero-sum equation, that if something new is allowed in, something else must be displaced. What actually happened was quieter and more demanding. My life didn't shrink or explode. It asked to be held more consciously. There were no milestones anyone else would recognize. No dramatic announcements, no visible markers that would make sense from the outside. But internally, I crossed many small thresholds. The first was letting go of the need to constantly monitor myself. I noticed how often in the early months I'd evaluated every feeling for significance, every impulse for danger. Over time, that vigilance softened. Not because I cared less, but because I trusted myself more. I'd proven, through restraint, honesty, and care, that curiosity didn't automatically lead to chaos. My relationship with her continued to evolve in ways that were not always comfortable, but consistently grounded. We learned how to revisit difficult topics without reopening wounds. We learned how to ask for reassurance without framing it as accusation. We learned that love does not require full understanding at every moment, but it does require good faith. There were days when she struggled, when the uncertainty felt heavier for her than for me. On those days, my responsibility was not to defend my process, but to remain present and accountable. Growth does not exempt you from consideration. I became more articulate, not in the sense of having better explanations, but in knowing what I could and could not promise. I couldn't promise outcomes. I couldn't promise that nothing would ever change again. But I could promise that I would not disappear into secrecy, that I would not make unilateral decisions that affected us both without conversation, that I would continue to examine my motives with honesty. Those promises mattered more than any declaration of identity. Outside our relationship, life continued largely unchanged. Friends talked about work, about plans, about trivial frustrations. Family interactions followed familiar patterns. And yet, I experienced these interactions differently. I was less invested in being effortlessly understood and more invested in being internally consistent. That shift reduced a kind of background anxiety I hadn't realized I was carrying. I no longer felt the need to constantly reinforce a version of myself that I now recognized as incomplete. There were moments, rare, but real, when misunderstanding brushed close. An offhand comment, an assumption that didn't quite fit. In the past, I would have corrected these immediately or absorbed them silently. Now, I learned to pause, to decide whether clarification would serve connection or simply my own discomfort. Sometimes I spoke. Sometimes I let things pass. That discernment felt like maturity, not compromise. The diet plan, which had once been the central organizing principle of our days, became a metaphor I returned to often. It had taught me that change rooted in punishment collapses, while change rooted in listening endures. I saw how often people try to manage identity the way they manage crises, through control, urgency, and force. What I'd learned instead was the value of sustained attention, of asking not what should I become, but what helps me live with integrity. I also became more cautious about narratives, especially my own. There was a temptation, at times, to retroactively frame everything as inevitable, as if the path I'd taken were the only one possible. That kind of storytelling is comforting, but dishonest. There were countless points at which I could have turned away, dismissed my experience, chosen numbness over curiosity. Acknowledging that preserved my humility. This wasn't destiny. It was choice, repeated gently over time. Emotionally, I felt more available than I ever had before. Less defended. That availability made joy more vivid and sorrow more precise. I no longer experienced emotions as interruptions to be managed, but as information to be interpreted. This didn't make life easier in a simplistic sense, but it made it truer. I felt less fragmented, less like I was negotiating between incompatible versions of myself. I thought often about education, not formal instruction, but lived example. About how little space there is, culturally, for slow, non-spectacular forms of self-discovery. How quickly complexity gets flattened into slogans or categories. I understood why that happens. Clarity is efficient, but efficiency comes at a cost. My own experience resisted easy framing, and that resistance felt worth protecting. What surprised me most, in the end, was how little this process was about becoming someone else. It was about becoming less divided, about reducing the distance between how I felt internally and how I moved through the world. Crossdressing, which might have seemed like the central fact from the outside, was never the core of the story. It was a language, one of several, that allowed me to understand myself more honestly. The real transformation was ethical, not aesthetic. I learned that accountability is not about restriction, it's about alignment. That empathy grows not from shared labels, but from shared attentiveness. That self-acceptance is not indulgence, but a prerequisite for integrity. These were not abstract lessons. They were lived, negotiated daily, sometimes imperfectly. If there's a consequence to all of this, and there always is, it is that I can no longer claim ignorance about myself. I know now what it feels like to listen and respond rather than suppress and endure. That knowledge carries responsibility. I am responsible for continuing to act with care, to remain open without being reckless, to honor both my inner truth and the lives intertwined with mine. Nothing about my life looks extraordinary, and yet, it feels inhabited in a way it never did before. I am no longer standing adjacent to myself, managing a role. I am here, participating, attentive. That is the transformation that mattered. And if there is one certainty I carry forward, it is this: becoming honest with yourself does not make life simpler, but it makes it possible to live without quietly disappearing. I sometimes think about how easily this story could be misunderstood if it were reduced to a single sentence, or even a single choice. How tempting it would be to summarize it as a turning point, a realization, a transformation neatly contained. That temptation mirrors the one I spent so long resisting in my own life: the urge to compress complexity into something easier to explain, easier to defend, easier to consume. But life, as I learned it here, does not move in summaries. What remains with me most strongly is not any specific act or admission, but the shift in how I relate to myself over time. I no longer treat my inner life as something to be managed at arm's length. I don't assume discomfort is a failure or that certainty is a prerequisite for honesty. I've learned to stay present through ambiguity, to let questions exist without immediately forcing them into answers that feel premature or protective. There are still moments of doubt, moments when old reflexes surface, urging me to simplify, to retreat into familiar outlines. I don't shame myself for those impulses anymore. I recognize them for what they are: learned strategies that once kept me safe, now gently retired. Awareness didn't erase them. It gave me choice. The relationships in my life bear the marks of this change, though not always in visible ways. Conversations are slower, more intentional. Silences feel less threatening. I am more careful with my words, not because I'm afraid of them, but because I respect their weight. When misunderstandings arise, as they inevitably do, I am less inclined to defend and more inclined to clarify. That difference has reshaped my sense of connection. I've also learned to accept that not everyone needs, wants, or is ready to understand this part of my experience. That acceptance no longer feels like resignation. It feels like discernment. I don't measure honesty by exposure alone, but by whether my actions remain aligned with my values across contexts. Privacy, I've discovered, can coexist with integrity when it is chosen consciously rather than enforced by fear. The diet plan that once seemed like the catalyst has long faded into the background of memory, its practical details mostly forgotten. What remains is its lesson: that attention changes things. That listening, sustained over time, reveals truths force cannot. I carry that lesson with me now, applying it not just to my body or my identity, but to how I live, how I love, how I decide. If there is education in this story, it is not instructional. It does not offer steps or prescriptions. It offers a reminder that identity is not something you arrive at once and then defend forever. It is something you negotiate, ethically and relationally, across time. That negotiation requires patience, humility, and a willingness to revise yourself without erasing yourself. I am still learning. That is not a disclaimer. It is a commitment. I am learning how to remain open without becoming untethered. How to honor curiosity without turning it into compulsion. How to be accountable without becoming rigid. These are not skills mastered and set aside. They are practices. When I look back at the person I was before all this began, I don't feel embarrassment or regret. I feel compassion. He did what he knew how to do with the tools he had. What changed wasn't his worth, but his access to himself. That access, once gained, cannot be unlearned. It asks to be used. My life did not become louder or more dramatic. It became quieter in a deeper way. Less crowded with avoidance. Less governed by unexamined rules. More deliberate. more inhabitable. And if there is an ending here at all, it is not a conclusion but a grounding. I am no longer waiting for permission from others or for myself to live attentively. I am doing so now, imperfectly, responsibly, and with care. That, in the end, is what stayed with me.